She was captured by my men. Now without her in my arms, I can't sleep. The giant cowboy said Marcus Henderson earned his nickname Bull, not from any meanness in his character, but from his sheer size and the unstoppable way he worked. Standing 6 feet and 8 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as a barn door and hands that could palm a watermelon like it was an apple, he was a sight that made people stop and stare. His shadow seemed to stretch for miles across the Montana grasslands, and when he walked into a room, the floorboards creaked under his weight. Bull had arrived in Montana territory 15 years earlier with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and $30 sewn into his boot. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a cattle driver, a railroad laborer, and anything else that paid. He saved every penny, slept under the stars to avoid paying for lodging, and ate beans and hardtack when other men spent their wages on whiskey and card games. By the time he turned 30, he'd saved enough to buy a small parcel of land near the Yellowstone River. That small parcel grew. Bull had an eye for good grazing land and a head for numbers that surprised people who assumed his size meant he was slow in thinking. He bought land when others were selling cheap, helped his neighbors during hard times and earned their loyalty, and slowly built an empire. The Bull Henderson Ranch now sprawled across 20,000 acres, employed 40 men year-round, and ran 5,000 head of cattle. Bull had become one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, though you'd never know it from his simple clothes and quiet manner. But wealth didn't protect anyone from trouble, and trouble had been brewing for months. A gang of thieves had been hitting homesteads and small ranches throughout the region, stealing horses, burning barns, and terrorizing families. The territorial marshal was overwhelmed, with too much ground to cover and too few deputies. People were scared, and some were talking about abandoning their claims and heading back east where law and order still meant something. Bull couldn't stand by and watch. These weren't just neighbors, they were friends. People who'd helped him when he was starting out, families who'd shared meals with him and trusted him. When the Johnsons lost 12 horses and their eldest son took a bullet in the leg trying to stop the thieves, Bull decided enough was enough. He called a meeting in his ranch house on a cold October evening. 23 men showed up, ranchers and ranch hands, all armed and all angry. Bull stood before them, his head nearly touching the ceiling beams, and laid out a plan. They would form a posse, track these thieves down, and bring them to justice. Some men wanted to talk about hanging and quick justice, but Bull cut them off with a sharp look. "We do this legal and proper," he said, his deep voice filling the room. "We capture them, we bring them to the marshal, and we let the law handle it. We're not becoming killers just because we're angry. We're better than that." His moral authority settled the matter. They would ride at dawn. Bull chose 15 of his best men for the posse. They were skilled trackers, good shots, and level-headed in a crisis. His foreman, a wiry Mexican man named Carlos who'd been with Bull since the early days, would stay behind to run the ranch. Carlos didn't like it, but he understood. Someone had to keep things running. They rode out as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The thieves had hit the Morrison place the night before, making off with 8 horses and all the money Morrison had hidden in his house. But they'd left a trail that even a child could follow. They were getting cocky, confident that no one would dare come after them. Bull and his men followed that trail for 3 days, pushing hard from dawn until dark. They crossed rocky hills where the wind howled like a wounded animal, forded icy streams that soaked them to the bone, and camped under stars so bright they looked like holes poked in a black blanket. The men grumbled about the cold and the hard riding, but nobody quit. They all knew what was at stake. On the morning of the 4th day, they found the thieves' camp. It was tucked into a bend of the Missouri River, hidden by cottonwood trees and thick brush. Smoke from a campfire drifted up into the gray dawn sky. Bull counted 6 men moving around the camp, drinking coffee and laughing about something. The stolen horses were tied to a line strung between 2 trees. "We surround them quiet-like," Bull whispered to his men. "Don't shoot unless they shoot first. We want them alive, if we can manage it." The men spread out, moving as silent as shadows through the brush. Bull took the direct approach, walking straight into camp with his rifle held ready but not aimed. He was counting on his size to make them think twice about fighting. "You boys are under arrest for horse theft and robbery," Bull announced, his voice carrying across the camp. "Throw down your weapons and put your hands where I can see them." For a moment, everything froze. The thieves stared at this giant of a man who had appeared in their camp like an avenging angel. Then one of them, a skinny fellow with a scar across his cheek, made a grab for his pistol. He never cleared leather. A shot from the trees knocked his hat off his head, and suddenly Bull's men were everywhere, rifles trained on the startled thieves. The fight, such as it was, ended before it really began. 5 of the 6 thieves threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The 6th, a young hothead who couldn't have been more than 20, tried to run and got tackled by 2 of Bull's ranch hands before he made it 10 feet. Bull's men tied up the thieves and started gathering evidence: the stolen horses, saddlebags full of cash and jewelry, even a list of ranches they'd been planning to hit next. It was a good haul, and the territorial marshal would be pleased. That's when Bull heard the sound, a muffled cry coming from a tent at the edge of the camp. He strode over and pulled back the tent flap. Inside, bound hand and foot with a gag in her mouth, was a young woman. Her dress was torn and dirty, her dark hair tangled with leaves and twigs, and her face was bruised, but her eyes burned with defiance and fury, not fear. Bull felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. Anger at what had been done to her, protectiveness, and something else, something deeper that he didn't have time to examine. "You're safe now, miss," he said gently, kneeling down to untie her bonds. His huge fingers fumbled with the knots, trying to be careful not to hurt her. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. I promise you that." When he pulled the gag from her mouth, she gasped for air, and then immediately started speaking in rapid Spanish, her words tumbling over each other. Bull caught maybe 1 word in 3. His Spanish was rough at best, but he understood she was asking about her family, about a wagon train, about how long she'd been held. "Easy now," he said, helping her to her feet. She swayed, weak from days of captivity, and he caught her before she fell. She was light as a feather in his arms, and he realized she probably hadn't eaten properly in days. "Let's get you some water and food first. Then we'll figure everything else out." He carried her out of the tent. His men had the thieves lined up and secured, and they all stopped to stare when they saw Bull emerge with the woman in his arms. Carlos's younger brother, Miguel, who'd come along as the camp cook, quickly brought water and some dried beef. The woman drank deeply, then tried to speak again. This time she switched to English, though her accent was thick and musical. "My name is Elena Morales. These men, they attacked our wagon train. 5 weeks ago, maybe 6, I don't know. They killed the men, took what they wanted. I thought they would kill me too, but..." Her voice trailed off and Bull didn't need her to finish. He could imagine what these animals had planned for her. Rage burned hot in his belly, but he kept his voice calm and gentle. "You're safe now, Miss Morales. I give you my word on that. We're taking these men to face justice, and we'll help you find out what happened to the rest of your people." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, studying his face. Bull was used to people flinching away from his size, from the roughness of his features, but Elena didn't flinch. She nodded slowly, as if she'd seen something in him that satisfied her. "Thank you," she whispered, and then her eyes rolled back and she fainted dead away. Bull caught her before she hit the ground, and for the second time that morning he found himself holding this stranger in his arms. But she didn't feel like a stranger. Something about her felt right, felt like she belonged there. He carried her to his horse, wrapped her in his own coat. It swallowed her small frame completely, and mounted up with her cradled against his chest. The ride back to his ranch would take 3 days, and Bull found himself unable to stop glancing down at her unconscious face, unable to explain the fierce protectiveness that had seized him. His men exchanged knowing looks behind his back, but nobody said anything. They'd never seen their boss act this way around a woman before. Bull Henderson, the giant who'd built an empire with his bare hands, who'd faced down claim jumpers and survived stampedes and wrestled steers to the ground, looked almost gentle as he held the sleeping woman. When they made camp that first night, Bull refused to let anyone else tend to Elena. He made sure she had the warmest blankets, positioned her near the fire but not too close, and sat up watching over her while his men slept. He stirred a few times, murmuring in Spanish, and each time Bull found himself leaning closer, as if he could protect her from even her nightmares. Elena woke to softness. After weeks of cold ground and rough handling, the sensation of clean sheets and a real mattress felt like a dream. For a moment she kept her eyes closed, afraid that opening them would shatter the illusion and return her to that terrible tent, to those rough voices and cruel hands. But when she finally opened her eyes, she found herself in a bedroom unlike any she'd ever seen. The bed was enormous, carved from dark wood, with posts that reached nearly to the ceiling. Lace curtains filtered golden afternoon sunlight through tall windows. A wash basin sat on a marble-top dresser, and her dirty, torn dress had been replaced with a clean white nightgown that smelled of lavender and soap. The door opened and an older woman entered, carrying a tray. She had gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the no-nonsense air of someone who'd seen everything life could throw at a person and survived it all. "Oh, good. You're awake," the woman said warmly, setting the tray on a bedside table. I'm Mrs. Patterson. I run the household here at the Bull Henderson Ranch. How are you feeling, dear? Elena tried to speak, but her throat was dry and sore. Mrs. Patterson immediately poured water from a pitcher and helped her drink. The cool liquid felt like heaven. Where am I? Elena managed to whisper. How did I get here? Mr. Henderson brought you here 3 days ago. You've been sleeping mostly, which is what your body needed. The doctor came and checked you over. You were half-starved and exhausted, but nothing that food and rest won't fix. Mrs. Patterson fluffed the pillows behind Elena's back. Now, let's get some soup into you. Beef broth with vegetables. Nothing too heavy for your stomach just yet. As Elena sipped the soup, it was delicious, rich and warming. She began to remember. The giant man who'd found her. The gentle way he'd carried her despite his terrifying size. The promise in his deep voice that she was safe now. Mr. Henderson, Elena said slowly. Is he here? Mrs. burst. Patterson's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. Oh, he's here all right. Been pacing the hallway outside your door like a caged bear for 3 days. Won't go tend to ranch business, won't sleep properly, just keeps asking if you've woken up yet. Never seen him act this way before. Elena felt her cheeks warm. I should thank him. He saved my life. You'll get your chance, dear. But first, you need to regain your strength. The master, that's what the ranch hands call him, though he hates it. He's given orders that you're not to be disturbed or rushed. You take all the time you need to heal. Over the next week, Elena slowly recovered her strength. Mrs. Patterson brought her meals 3 times a day each, one more delicious than the last. The housekeeper also brought books, after learning that Elena could read in both English and Spanish. Elena devoured them hungrily, having gone months without anything to read during the wagon train journey, but she didn't see Bull Henderson, not once. Sometimes she heard his voice in the hallway, that deep rumble that seemed to make the walls vibrate. Once, late at night, she woke to find wild flowers in a jar on her bedside table, purple asters and white yarrow, clearly picked from the rangeland. They appeared every morning after that, always fresh, always carefully arranged, but always left while she slept. Elena began to wonder if she'd imagined the gentleness she'd seen in his eyes. Maybe he was avoiding her because he found her presence inconvenient. Maybe he regretted bringing her here at all. Mrs. Patterson noticed her growing restlessness. The master thinks his size frightens people, she explained one afternoon while helping Elena into a borrowed dress, one of Mrs. Meredith, Patterson's own, taken in to fit Elena's smaller frame. He's had some hard experiences with folks who couldn't see past the outside of him to the good man underneath, so he keeps his distance, thinking he's being kind. That's foolish, Elena said with more heat than she intended. He saved my life. I'm not some delicate flower who faints at the sight of a tall man. Mrs. Patterson smiled broadly. Well then, perhaps you should tell him that yourself. He's in his study right now, wrestling with the account books. Man can break a wild horse and build a barn with his bare hands, but numbers give him fits. Elena found herself walking down the wide hallway before she could think better of it. The ranch house was beautiful, all polished wood and comfortable furniture, but without the fussy decoration she'd seen in wealthy homes back east. It felt like a place where people actually lived and worked, not just showed off their money. The study door was partly open. Elena paused outside, suddenly nervous. What would she say? How did you thank someone for saving you from a nightmare? Then she heard a frustrated groan and the sound of a pencil being thrown across the room. Despite her nervousness, Elena smiled. She knocked gently on the doorframe. Mrs. Patterson, I told you I'd figure these numbers out myself. Bull's voice cut off abruptly as he looked up and saw Elena standing in the doorway. He stood so quickly his chair fell over backward with a crash. For a moment they just stared at each other. Elena had forgotten just how big he was. His head nearly touched the ceiling and his shoulders seemed to fill the entire room. But his face, rough and weathered as it was, held such open surprise and concern that Elena felt her nervousness melt away. Miss Morales, he said, and his voice was gentler than a man his size had any right to sound. You should be resting. Are you well? Do you need anything? I can have Mrs. Adam. Patterson, I'm fine, Elena interrupted, stepping into the room. Thanks to you. I came to say thank you, Mr. Henderson. You saved my life, and I haven't even been able to tell you how grateful I am. Bull's face turned red, and he looked down at his boots like a schoolboy caught stealing apples. No need for thanks, miss. Any decent person would have done the same. But you did it. You tracked those men down, you found me, and you brought me here to recover. Elena moved closer, noticing the papers scattered across his desk. Mrs. Patterson says the account books are giving you trouble? He looked embarrassed. I can manage. Just takes me a bit longer than most. Never had much schooling. Taught myself to read and figure numbers, but some of this fancy bookkeeping still confuses me. Elena looked at the ledgers spread across the desk. She'd kept books for her father's trading business back in Santa Fe before joining the wagon train west. These accounts were actually quite simple, just disorganized. I could help, she offered, if you'd like. I used to manage my father's accounts. Bull looked at her with such hope in his eyes that Elena felt her heart squeeze. You don't owe me anything, Miss Morales. You're a guest here, not a servant. I know that. But I can't just sit in that beautiful room day after day doing nothing. I'll go mad. Please, let me help. At least until I figure out what to do next. The mention of her leaving made Bull's expression change, something that looked almost like pain crossing his face before he hit it. About that, miss. I've been making inquiries. The wagon train you were traveling with, I'm sorry, but there were no survivors besides you. The thieves scattered the wagons and took what they wanted. A few folks from a nearby settlement buried the dead. Elena had known deep down that her traveling companions were gone, but hearing it confirmed still hit her like a physical blow. She sat down heavily in the chair across from Bull's desk, tears streaming down her face. She'd been traveling with the Johnsons, a kind family with 3 children. The Parkers, newlyweds full of hope about their new life, old Mr. Chen, who'd told wonderful stories around the campfire. All gone. She felt Bull's presence before she saw him move. He'd come around the desk and knelt beside her chair, making himself smaller, less imposing. He offered her a handkerchief that looked tiny in his massive hand. I'm sorry, miss. I truly am. If there's family back east you want to return to, I'll arrange passage and make sure you get there safely. Or if you want to stay in the territory, I'll help you find respectable work and lodging. Whatever you need. Elena wiped her eyes and looked at this gentle giant kneeling beside her. I have no family back east. My parents died 5 years ago. I was traveling west to start fresh, to maybe find teaching work in one of the mining towns. I have nothing now. No belongings, no money, just the charity of strangers. Then stay here, Bull said quietly. Not as charity. I meant what I said about the bookkeeping. I'll pay you fair wages, same as I'd pay any clerk. You can save up money, figure out your next step. Mrs. Patterson would love the company. She complains about being the only woman on a ranch full of rough men. He managed a small smile. And, truth be told, those account books really do confuse me something terrible. Elena found herself laughing through her tears. You're offering me a job? Just like that? Why not? You clearly know your numbers, and I clearly need help with mine. Seems like good business to me. He stood up, moving back to give her space, always conscious of his size. Think about it. No pressure. You take all the time you need to heal and decide what you want to do. But Elena had already decided. Something about this place, about this awkward giant who left wildflowers by her bedside and blushed when she thanked him, felt right. Felt safe, felt like maybe, just maybe, she could build something here. I accept, she said firmly. When can I start? Bull's face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Really? You're sure? I mean, it's hard work, and the ranch hands can be rough company, and... Mr. Henderson, Elena interrupted, standing up and straightening her borrowed dress. Stop trying to talk me out of it. Now, show me these account books that are causing you such trouble. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into life at the Bull Henderson Ranch. She worked in the study each morning, organizing the accounts and making sense of years of scattered record-keeping. The numbers told the story of the ranch's growth, modest beginnings, careful investments, steady expansion. She could see Bull's character in every entry. The way he'd helped neighbors during hard times, the fair wages he paid his workers, the quality stock he invested in. Bull himself remained somewhat distant, though Elena noticed he found excuses to pass by the study several times each day. He'd poke his head in to ask if she needed anything, if the fire was warm enough, if the light was good enough for reading the small print. Each time he'd linger just a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, then retreat to his work outside. The wildflowers continued to appear every morning. Elena began taking her afternoon tea on the front porch, enjoying the vast Montana landscape. The ranch stretched as far as she could see, rolling grasslands dotted with cattle, mountains purple in the distance. It was beautiful in a way that was completely different from anything she'd known before. One afternoon, Bull appeared leading 2 horses, a gentle mare and his own massive gelding that looked like it had draft horse blood in it. "Thought you might like to see more of the ranch," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "If you know how to ride, that is. No pressure if you don't." Elena smiled. "I can ride. My father had horses in Santa Fe." Bull's face showed relief and pleasure. He helped her mount the mare, his hands gentle despite their size, then swung into his own saddle with surprising grace for such a big man. They rode out across the rangeland, Bull pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the ranch. Elena learned that he'd named every significant place on his property: Thunder Creek, where lightning had struck during his first cattle drive; Grace Point, where his mother had stood when she'd visited once before she died; Stubborn Hill, where he'd spent 2 weeks clearing rocks before he could build his first barn. "You loved your mother very much," Elena observed. Bull nodded, his expression softening. "She was a good woman. Worked her fingers to the bone to make sure I had food and schooling, such as it was. She died before she could see what I'd built here. I think she would have been proud." "I think she would have been very proud," Elena said gently. As the weeks turned into months, their rides became a daily ritual. Bull taught Elena the patterns of ranch life: when to move cattle to fresh grazing, how to spot a sick animal, the delicate balance of managing land and livestock. She taught him better bookkeeping methods and started reading poetry aloud in Spanish while they rode, translating the beautiful passages into English. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss. Bull smiled more, laughed at their jokes, seemed lighter somehow. And the way he looked at Elena when she wasn't watching, well, every man on the ranch could see which way that wind was blowing. But Bull himself seemed blind to it, or perhaps afraid to acknowledge it. Elena learned why one evening when she overheard him talking to Carlos in the barn. "She's educated, Carlos, refined. She reads poetry and knows things about the world. What would a woman like that want with a man like me? I'm just a big, rough rancher who can barely read. Had a woman once who said she'd marry me, but when it came down to it, she called me brutal. Said I was too big, too rough, too uncivilized. Said she could never love a man who reminded her of a beast." Elena's heart ached hearing the pain in his voice. She slipped away before they could notice her, but Bull's words haunted her. "I would know." That night, she left a note under his door along with the wildflowers he'd left for her that morning. It was a poem in Spanish, with her English translation underneath. "The oak tree does not apologize for its strength, nor the mountain for its height. True beauty lies not in being small, but in knowing one's own worth." The next morning, Bull appeared at the study door earlier than usual. He held the note in his hands, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "Miss Morales?" "Elena," he said quietly. "That woman who called me brutal, she didn't know me, didn't want to know me. But you've seen me every day for 3 months now. You've never flinched away, never treated me like I was something to be feared." "Why?" Elena stood up and walked around the desk until she stood directly in front of him. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, but she didn't mind. "Because you're not brutal, Bull Henderson. You're the gentlest man I've ever met. You leave flowers for a stranger. You offer help without expecting anything in return. You teach with patience and listen with kindness. Your size doesn't frighten me. It's just part of who you are, like your kindness and your strength and your good heart." Bull stared at her, and Elena could see him struggling with something. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I think I'm falling in love with you, Elena Morales. And it scares me more than anything I've ever faced. Because I don't know if someone like you could ever feel the same way about someone like me." Elena's heart soared. She reached up and took his hand, her small fingers barely wrapping around his. "Then let me make it simple for you, Bull Henderson." "I already do." The confession changed everything and nothing at the same time. Bull and Elena didn't suddenly transform into a conventional courting couple. They were both too practical for grand romantic gestures, too scarred by their pasts to rush headlong into anything. But there was a new understanding between them now, an acknowledgement that hung in the air like morning mist over the grasslands. Bull still left wildflowers outside her door each morning, but now he waited to see her smile when she found them. Elena still worked on the account books, but now Bull would sit across from her in the study pretending to read ranch reports while actually just watching her work. Their afternoon rides continued, but now their hands would sometimes brush when passing a canteen of water, and neither would pull away quickly. Mrs. Patterson watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who'd predicted this outcome from the very first day. She'd started humming while she cooked, and the ranch hands claimed the food had gotten even better, if such a thing was possible. It was during one of their rides, about a week after Bull's confession, that everything began to unravel. They had ridden further than usual, up into the hills where Bull owned timberland. He wanted to show Elena a meadow full of late-season wildflowers, a place he said was his favorite spot on the entire ranch. They were laughing about something, Elena teasing Bull about his terrible Spanish pronunciation, when a rider appeared on the trail ahead. The man was well dressed in a way that looked out of place in ranch country. His suit was Eastern cut and expensive, his horse was a show animal rather than a working mount, and he wore a pearl-handled pistol on his hip that looked more decorative than functional. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver streaking his dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Bull's entire demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, and Elena could feel danger radiating from him like heat from a stove. "Henderson," the man said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Fancy meeting you out here on such a fine day, and with such lovely company, too." "Vance," Bull replied, his voice flat and cold. "This is my land. You're trespassing." The man called Vance smiled wider. Now, no need for hostility between neighbors. I was just riding through admiring the landscape. You know how I am about beautiful things. His eyes slid to Elena in a way that made her skin crawl. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your companion?" "No," Bull said simply. "Turn your horse around and leave. Now." Vance's smile finally faded. "You can't keep ignoring reality forever, Henderson. This territory is changing. The railroad is coming, bringing civilization with it. Men like you, rough frontier types who built empires on brute strength, your time is ending. Men like me, with education and Eastern connections and proper breeding, we're the future." "Is there a point to this speech?" Bull asked. "Or do you just like hearing yourself talk?" "The point, you oversized brute, is that I'm going to own this territory one day. All of it, including your precious ranch. You can sell to me now for a fair price, or you can wait until I take it from you for nothing." Vance's voice had turned hard and ugly. "That's what happens to dinosaurs, Henderson. They go extinct." Bull urged his horse forward, positioning himself between Vance and Elena. "You've been trying to buy my land for 5 years, Vance. The answer hasn't changed. It's not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Now get off my property before I throw you off." Vance's hand moved toward his pistol, and Elena's heart jumped into her throat. But Bull was faster than a man his size had any right to be. He had his rifle out of its saddle holster and leveled at Vance before the other man's hand even touched his gun. "Don't," Bull said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Just don't." For a long moment, the three of them froze like a tableau. Then Vance slowly moved his hand away from his pistol. His face had gone pale, but his eyes burned with hatred. "This isn't over, Henderson. Not by a long shot." He looked at Elena again. "Watch yourself, miss. Men who associate with Henderson tend to end up hurt. It's the price of his brutality." He turned his horse and rode away, but not before Elena saw him looking back over his shoulder, his eyes calculating and cold. Bull didn't lower his rifle until Vance was completely out of sight. Then he turned to Elena, and she was startled to see fear in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear for her. "We need to get back to the ranch. Now." They rode hard, and Bull didn't speak until they were safely inside the ranch house with the door bolted behind them. He called for Carlos and Mrs. Patterson, and the grim look on his face brought them both running. "Cornelius Vance is making his move," Bull said without preamble. "I need double guards on the property starting tonight. Nobody comes or goes without being checked. And I need to get word to the marshal." "What happened?" Carlos demanded. Bull explained the encounter, and with each word, Carlos's expression grew darker. When Bull finished, the foreman let loose a string of Spanish curses that made even Elena blush. "That snake," Carlos spat. "Boss, he's been behind the troubles in the territory, hasn't he? The raids, the thefts. It's all been him trying to drive people off their land so he can buy it cheap." "I've suspected it for months," Bull admitted. "But I couldn't prove anything. The thieves we caught wouldn't talk. Claimed they were working alone, but Vance is getting desperate now. The railroad's coming through, and he wants to control as much land as possible before it gets here. Property values will skyrocket." Mrs. Patterson had gone very still. "Mr. Henderson, that wagon train attack, the one where Miss Elena was taken. Where did that happen?" Bull and Elena exchanged glances. "About 40 miles southwest of here," Elena said slowly. "Near the territorial road." "Why?" "Because that's exactly where the railroad surveyors said the line would run," Mrs. Patterson said grimly. "Ance has been trying to buy up all that land for the past year. If he could scare off the settlers, make it look too dangerous to homestead there, he could buy it for pennies on the dollar." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "You're saying the attack on our wagon train," that was Vance, He ordered those men to kill innocent people just to clear land for speculation? I can't prove it, Bull said, but his voice was heavy with certainty. But yes, I believe that's exactly what happened. And if you could testify that the men who attacked your wagon train were the same ones we captured, if you could connect them to Vance in any way, I'd be a threat to him, Elena finished quietly. A witness who could destroy his plans and maybe put him in prison for murder. Bull crossed the room in 2 long strides and took Elena's hands in his. I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it. You're under my protection now, and Vance would have to go through me to get to you. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Elena whispered. Bull, I've heard things in town. Vance is ruthless. He has money, connections, hired guns. If he wants me gone, then he'll have to deal with me and every man on this ranch, Carlos interrupted fiercely. Miss Elena, you saved this place with your bookkeeping. You found where we were bleeding money, got us organized, made us profitable in ways we never were before. You're family now. We protect family. Over the next 3 weeks, the ranch became an armed camp. Bull hired additional men, all of them skilled with weapons and loyal to him personally. Guard posts were established at every entrance to the property. The women, Elena and Mrs. Patterson, were never allowed outside without armed escorts. The cheerful, easy atmosphere of the ranch had been replaced by watchful tension. Elena tried to continue her work on the accounts, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept thinking about the Johnson family, about little Sarah Johnson who'd given Elena a wildflower the morning before the attack, about Mr. Parker teaching his young wife to drive the wagon, about Mr. Chen's stories of his homeland across the sea, all of them dead, murdered on Cornelius Vance's orders so he could make money from their land. The rage that built in her chest was unlike anything she'd ever felt before. One afternoon, while Bull was out inspecting the guard posts, a rider approached the ranch. He wore a U.S. Marshal's badge and carried official-looking documents in his saddlebag. Marshal William Tucker was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Carlos brought him to the study where Elena was working, and after verifying his credentials, she sent for Bull. Miss Morales, the marshal said, settling into a chair, I understand you survived the wagon train massacre on the southwestern road about 3 months back? I did, Elena confirmed, her voice steady despite the painful memories. And I understand you were held captive by the men who committed that crime before Mr. Henderson and his men rescued you. That's correct. The marshal pulled out a stack of photographs, the new kind made with the latest camera technology. Can you identify any of these men as being among those who attacked your wagon train? Elena looked through the photographs carefully. Her hands started shaking when she reached the 4th image. Him. That's one of them. I remember his voice. He was giving orders. And this one, she pointed to another photo. He was there too. You're certain? Completely certain. I heard their voices for weeks. I'd know them anywhere. Marshal Tucker nodded grimly. Those men were in the gang, mister. Henderson captured. They've been in territorial lockup awaiting trial. One of them finally started talking, trying to cut a deal. He claims they were hired by Cornelius Vance to clear settlers off the southwestern road so Vance could buy the land cheap. Bull, who'd arrived just in time to hear this, let out a long breath. Can you prove it? With Miss Morales' testimony connecting these men to the wagon train attack and with the confession of the gang member, I believe I can. But there's a problem. The marshal looked uncomfortable. Vance has powerful friends, territorial judges, politicians, even some federal officials. Building a case against him will take time, and he's going to know we're investigating. Miss Morales could be in danger. She's already in danger, Bull said flatly. Vance knows she's here. He knows she's a witness. Which is why I need to ask you something difficult, Miss Morales. The marshal leaned forward. Would you be willing to testify before a grand jury? It would mean going to the territorial capital, being in the public eye, possibly facing threats and intimidation. It won't be easy or safe. Elena thought of the Johnsons, of the Parkers, of Mr. Chen, of all the innocent people who died so one greedy man could make money. Yes, she said firmly. I'll testify. I'll tell everyone what happened. Vance needs to answer for what he's done. Bull's hand found hers under the table and squeezed gently. She could feel him trembling, this giant of a man shaking with fear for her. But when she looked at him, she saw pride in his eyes too. When? Bull asked the marshal. 2 weeks. I need time to prepare the case, gather more evidence, make sure we have everything lined up properly. In the meantime, I'd recommend Miss Morales stay here where she's protected, and Mr. Henderson, you might want to consider hiring additional security. Vance is cornered now, and cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. After the marshal left, Bull and Elena stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the Montana grasslands. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and serene, a stark contrast to the storm brewing around them. "You don't have to do this," Bull said quietly. "We could leave, go to California or Oregon, start fresh somewhere Vance can't reach us." Elena turned to face him. "And leave him free to do this to other people? To other families?" "No, Bull. I've spent 3 months recovering from what he did. 3 months safe in your home while he walks free and plans his next move. I can't run. I won't. He could kill you, Elena. If he's desperate enough, if he thinks he's losing everything, he could send men to—" Bull couldn't finish the sentence. "Then you'll protect me," Elena said simply, "like you've been protecting me since the day you found me. I trust you, Bull Henderson. With my life, with my future, with everything. Do you trust me to be strong enough for this?" Bull pulled her into his arms, and Elena rested her head against his massive chest, listening to his heart thunder beneath her ear. "I trust you," he whispered into her hair. "I just wish I didn't have to watch you walk into danger." "We'll walk into it together," Elena promised. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Neither of them knew that Cornelius Vance was already making his move, that hired guns were already riding toward the ranch, that the peaceful life they'd built together was about to shatter like glass. The trial of Cornelius Vance became the biggest news in Montana territory. Newspapers from as far away as San Francisco sent reporters to cover it. The territorial courthouse in Helena was packed every single day, with people standing in the aisles and crowding outside the windows just to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Elena sat in the witness chair for 3 full days, telling her story over and over. She described the attack on the wagon train in careful detail, the sudden appearance of the raiders at dawn, the gunfire, the screams, the way the men had systematically looted everything of value before setting fire to the wagons. She identified the men who'd attacked them, matching their faces to those Bull had captured. She described the weeks of captivity, the rough handling, the constant fear. Vance's lawyers tried everything to discredit her. They suggested she was mistaken about the identities. They implied she was working with Bull Henderson to frame their client out of some business rivalry. They even hinted that perhaps she'd been with the thieves willingly, that she'd invented the story of being captured to save her reputation. That last accusation was a mistake. Elena stood up in the witness box, her dark eyes flashing with fury. "I watched Sarah Johnson die," she said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. She was 8 years old. She loved wildflowers and had a doll named Martha that her grandmother made her. The raiders shot her father first, then her mother, who was trying to shield her. Sarah ran to me, and I held her while she cried. Then, one of those men, she pointed at the defendant's table, that man right there, shot her because she wouldn't stop crying. She died in my arms, and you dare suggest I was there willingly? There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge had to pause to compose himself. Vance's lawyer sat down and didn't ask any more questions. But Elena wasn't the only witness. Marshal Tucker had built his case carefully. 3 members of the raiding gang had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. They all said the same thing. Cornelius Vance had hired them to clear settlers off the southwestern road. He'd paid them in gold, given them specific instructions about which wagon trains to hit, which homesteads to burn. He'd promised them more money once the railroad came through, and he could sell the land at enormous profit. The territorial surveyor testified that Vance had somehow gotten advance information about the railroad route, information that wasn't supposed to be public yet. Several politicians admitted, reluctantly, that Vance had been pressuring them for details about the railroad's plans. Most damning of all was Vance's own ranch foreman, a man named Dutch Kerner, who'd worked for Vance for 15 years. Kerner had grown a conscience after learning that children had died in the wagon train attacks. He brought records with him, ledgers showing payments to the raiders, correspondence with corrupt officials, even a map with the planned railroad route and notes about which properties to acquire. Bull sat in the courtroom gallery every single day, watching. He was too big for the seats, so he stood in the back, his arms crossed, his face grim. Every time Vance's lawyers got aggressive with Elena, every time they raised their voices or tried to intimidate her, Bull would take a step forward. He never said anything, never made a sound, but his presence was a reminder. Harm her at your own risk. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder. Ordering the deaths of civilians. Theft. Fraud. Corruption of public officials. The judge sentenced Cornelius Vance to hang, though the sentence would likely be commuted to life in prison given his connections. Still, his empire was finished. His assets would be seized to pay restitution to the victims' families. His name would be synonymous with greed and murder. When the verdict was read, Vance turned and looked directly at Elena. His face was twisted with hatred. "This isn't over," he mouthed. "You'll pay for this." But it was over. Guards led him away in chains, and Elena finally allowed herself to breathe. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to celebrate. People wanted to shake Elena's hand, to thank her for her courage. Bull stayed close, his hand on her back, guiding her through the crowd toward their wagon. They'd been staying in Helena for the duration of the trial, at a small hotel near the courthouse, but now they could finally go home. The ride back to the ranch took 2 days. They traveled with an armed escort provided by Marshal Tucker, just in case any of Vance's remaining associates tried something foolish. But the journey was peaceful, and as they crossed onto Bull Henderson ranch land, Elena felt tension she'd been carrying for months finally release. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself preparing for their return. The ranch house was spotless, flowers filled every room, and she'd cooked enough food to feed an army. The ranch hands had strung up lanterns around the yard, and when Bull and Elena arrived, everyone gathered to welcome them home with cheers and applause. Carlos approached Bull with a grin. "Boss, the men took a vote. We want to throw a proper celebration. Dancing, food, music, the whole works. What do you say?" Bull looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded. They deserved this. Everyone deserved this. The party happened 3 days later on a Saturday evening. Ranch families from all over the territory came. People Bull had helped over the years, neighbors who had stood by him during the troubles with Vance, friends who simply wanted to celebrate justice being served. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else a guitar, and soon music filled the Montana evening air. Elena wore a new dress that Mrs. Patterson had secretly commissioned from the dressmaker in town, deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes. When Bull saw her, he stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth falling open. "You're beautiful," he said simply, and the raw honesty in his voice made Elena's heart swell. "Dance with me," she said, holding out her hand. Bull looked terrified. "Elena, I don't know how to dance. I'll step on your feet, I'll make a fool of us both." "Then we'll look foolish together," Elena said firmly, taking his hand and pulling him toward the space that had been cleared for dancing. Bull was right. He was terrible at dancing. His feet were too big, his movements too stiff, and he had no sense of rhythm whatsoever. But Elena didn't care. She laughed as he stumbled, helped him find the beat, and when he accidentally stepped on her foot for the 3rd time, she just hugged him tighter. "I love you," she said, loud enough for only him to hear over the music. "I love your kindness, your strength, your terrible dancing, all of it." Bull stopped moving, standing frozen in the middle of the dance floor while couples swirled around them. "Marry me," he blurted out. "I know I should do this properly, with a ring and a planned speech, but, Elena, I can't wait anymore. I almost lost you. When you were testifying and Vance's lawyers were attacking you, when he threatened you after the verdict, all I could think was that I should have told you sooner, should have made sure you knew." "Yes," Elena interrupted, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Yes, I'll marry you, you wonderful rambling giant of a man." The music stopped. Everyone had noticed them standing still in the middle of the floor, had heard Elena's acceptance. For a moment, silence fell over the party. Then Carlos let out a whoop of joy, and suddenly everyone was cheering and clapping. Mrs. Patterson was crying happy tears. Carlos was slapping Bull on the back hard enough to stagger a smaller man. The ranch hands were already planning the biggest wedding Montana territory had ever seen. They married 6 weeks later in the church in town, but the real celebration happened at the ranch. Over 300 people attended, and the party lasted until dawn. Bull had a special surprise for Elena. He'd spent every spare moment building an addition to the ranch house, a beautiful library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and big windows that let in the Montana sunshine. "I know you love reading, and I thought you should have a proper place for it." Elena cried when she saw it, but they were happy tears. She'd filled the shelves over the following months, books in English and Spanish, poetry and history, novels and technical manuals. It became her favorite room in the house, and Bull's too, though he claimed he just liked watching her read. True to her word at the trial, Elena had worked with the territorial government to establish a fund for the families of those killed in the wagon train attack and other raids orchestrated by Vance. Money from the seizure of Vance's assets went to help widows and orphans, to rebuild burned homesteads, to support communities that had been terrorized. She also convinced Bull to turn part of the ranch into a way station for settlers heading west. They built small cabins where families could stay for free while getting established, offer job training and temporary work, help people find land and make connections. It became known as Henderson's Hope, and over the years hundreds of families passed through it on their way to building new lives. Bull never quite got comfortable with being called a hero. When reporters came to interview him about capturing Vance's raiders or about the way station program, he'd turn red and insist that Elena deserved all the credit. "I just provided the space," he'd say. "Elena's the one with the vision and the heart." But everyone who knew them understood the truth. They were partners in every sense of the word. Bull provided the strength and the resources. Elena provided the organization and the compassion. Together, they built something that lasted. Their first child, a daughter, was born 2 years after the wedding. They named her Sarah Grace, after the little girl Elena had held as she died, and after Bull's mother. Sarah inherited her father's height and her mother's dark eyes, and she grew up fearless and kind. 2 more children followed. A son they named Carlos William after Bull's foreman and the marshal who'd helped them, and another daughter they called Hope, for obvious reasons. The children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, though the scary parts were softened for young ears. They learned that their father had rescued their mother, that their mother had been brave enough to stand up to evil men, that love and courage could overcome any obstacle. Years later, when Sarah was 15 and starting to understand the adult world better, she asked her mother about those early days. "Were you scared, Mama? When you had to testify against that awful man?" Elena thought carefully before answering. They were sitting in the library, the room Bull had built for her all those years ago. Through the window, she could see Bull teaching their son how to rope cattle, his massive frame bending patiently over the boy's smaller one. "I was terrified," Elena admitted. "Every single day. But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Bravery's doing what's right even when you're afraid." "And Papa? Was he scared too?" Elena smiled. "Your father was the most scared of all. Not for himself. He's never been afraid for himself. But he was afraid something might happen to me." "That's what love does, Sarah. It makes you vulnerable. It gives you something precious to lose, but it also gives you something precious to fight for." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Papa still checks on you at night. I've seen him. Even though you're right there beside him, he wakes up and just looks at you, like he's making sure you're real." "He does," Elena confirmed softly, "and he probably always will. Some fears don't go away, sweetheart. You just learn to live with them. Your father lived through almost losing me, and it changed him. Now he needs to reassure himself that I'm still here, still safe. It's his way of loving me." "That's kind of beautiful," Sarah said, in a sad way. "Love is often beautiful in sad ways," Elena agreed. "The depth of your father's love is measured by the depth of his fear at losing it. I wouldn't change that about him for anything." The years passed peacefully. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. The way station helped hundreds of families. Bull and Elena grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. Bull's hair turned white, and his massive frame finally started to show its age, but he never stopped leaving wildflowers for Elena. Some mornings they were flowers from the rangeland. Other mornings, when winter made wildflowers impossible, they were carved from wood. Bull had taught himself woodworking in his spare time, and his rough hands created surprisingly delicate flower sculptures. Elena's dark hair gained threads of silver, and she needed spectacles for her reading, but she never stopped organizing, planning. She expanded the way station program to include education, bringing in teachers to help settler children who'd missed years of schooling during their travels west. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the territorial government presented them with a commendation for their service to Montana. The ceremony was held at the ranch, and the governor himself attended. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," the governor said in his speech, "you have demonstrated that true heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's about consistent kindness, about seeing injustice and working every day to make it right, about building something that lifts others up. You've made Montana Territory a better place, and we are grateful." That night, after all the guests had gone home and the children were asleep, Bull and Elena sat on their porch watching the stars. Bull's arm was around Elena's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth. "Do you ever think about that day?" Bull asked quietly. "The day I found you?" "Every day," Elena admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if you hadn't been the one to find me. If it had been someone cruel, or indifferent, or just practical enough to drop me at the nearest town and forget about me, I couldn't have forgotten you," Bull said. "From the moment I saw you, something changed. Like I'd been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for." Elena turned to look up at him. Even after 25 years, the sight of his face still made her heart flutter. You know what I think? I think we saved each other. You saved my life that day in the Raiders' camp, but I saved your heart. You were so convinced you were too big, too rough, too much for anyone to love. I showed you that was nonsense. You did, Bull agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You showed me that strength doesn't have to mean loneliness, that being big doesn't mean being brutal, that someone could look past the surface and see me, really see me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind rustled through the grass. A horse whinnied softly in the barn. Bull? Elena said eventually. Thank you for not giving up on yourself, for believing me when I said you were worth loving, for building this life with me. Bull's arms tightened around her. Thank you for being brave enough to stay, for testifying against Vance when you could have run, for choosing me when you could have chosen safety somewhere far away from territorial troubles and rough ranchers. I chose right, Elena said firmly. I'd choose you again. Every time, in every life, I'd choose you. And there, under the Montana stars, in the home they'd built together from courage and kindness and stubborn love, the giant cowboy held his wife close and knew that he was, finally and forever, exactly where he belonged.